Thanks, Jacob. And thanks to all of you, Rabia and Sveta and others for inviting me and giving me the chance to share some of these ideas with you. I really enjoyed this conference. I've learned a lot from you. And I want to make two apologias. I'm going to be walking through a number of quotations. You'll see in a minute. I'm fighting some sort of throat thing, so I'm having a little trouble speaking. So I won't read the quotes for you, but as I put them up, I'll just give you, a minute or so just to absorb them, and then I'll make comments on them. So that'll save my voice a little bit. The other apologia occurred to me when I heard a comment this afternoon about how certain disciplines can be annoying. And of course, philosophy lays claim to be maybe the most annoying discipline of all, as well as the oldest, for three reasons. One is we don't do any empirical research. We just steal other people's empirical research that we happen to find interesting and comment upon it. Of course, my philosophical colleague, Nicole Whalen, has put me to shame by actually doing a little bit of empirical research in her last talk, but I'm going to be a purist. I'm not doing anything. So the second is that philosophers are used to making incredibly grandiose normative claims that are clearly controversial and just going with them, without apparently any serious acknowledgement sometimes of their controversy. And lastly, we have incredible arrogance in thinking that we can actually justify some of these normative claims just on the basis of argumentation. So I plead guilty to all these annoying characteristics of philosophers, and I'm just going to go for it. But I'm sure I will, and I hope I will in some ways provoke some of you to call me on some of this stuff in questions. So let's get started. These are two quotations from Karl Kautsky, his book from 1899. In thinking, well, let me just give you a minute to read them. I don't know how long it takes to read those quotes. You may notice some discrepancy between the two senses. So in thinking about the notion of the land question in preparation for this conference, I remembered a source that I knew about but was unfamiliar with, Karl Kautsky's 1899 study of the agrarian question. And Kautsky's work, praised even by opponents of his, such as Lenin, is concerned with a very different set of questions than we are, in particular the question of how the socialist movement should deal with a still substantial farmer and peasant population in Europe and their problems in the face of the capitalization of land and agricultural production. But I thought he makes a couple of observations in this book, which in some ways is dated, but not entirely, that are relevant to our situation. So in the first quotation, he writes, it's a transition, in the transition from an agrarian to an industrial society, agriculture becomes just another industry. Its role as a way of life for millions of food producers who are self-subsistent is increasingly compromised by the industrialization and concentration of agricultural production into fewer and fewer sites, and by the corresponding financialization of land as just one more fungible source of profit. But as he states in the second quotation, and seemingly in contradiction or maybe tension with the first, land remains a vital factor in the character of all human societies. In particular, there's an ongoing relation between the productivity of land and the valorization of labor to the extent that if either factor of production declines, capital will seek value from the other. And this also suggests why 21st century resistance to the exploitation of labor must be, as I'm calling it, ecosocialist. Industrial relations are connected to rural relations of production in both agriculture and extractive industries, and these require socialization as well. Now, as is obvious, we confront in our own time a very different set of problems from those faced by Kautsky. One important difference is that the critique of industrial society, as theorized by critical theorists such as our buddy Theodor Adorno, is now part of our intellectual legacy. The critique was rooted first in the rejection of productivism, a feature of both capitalist and socialist theories of social reproduction, which sought to continually maximize the productive efficiency of industrial enterprises, whether for profit or for social welfare. The second concept that separates our contemporary thinking about matters such as land is that of the domination of nature, a term that has admittedly been largely drummed out of official critical theory, and at least until recently, But the environmental movement picked it up in the 1960s and 70s as the critical theorists were passing away and used it to theorize their own struggles. As Michel Serres, a French philosopher, calls it, against the war on the world. So now I'll give you a minute to look at, these are shorter quotations, but of course Adorno, one sentence of Adorno is worth paragraphs or as difficult as paragraphs of other people. The result, as we see in the two quotations from Adorno, is on the one hand, the rejection of the productivist view, indeed perhaps of industrial society as such, and on the other hand, the reconsideration of nature as a necessary context for understanding land, labor, and the material conditions within which they function. The notion, as Adorno writes, that industrial society might be rejected for a less intensive form of social reproduction, one that doesn't attempt to extract, exploit, and valorize all of nature and labor, suggests the real alternative to a society of continually intensifying exploitation, or at least I would claim. By the way, this is the idea of resilience, to use a term from environmental science, the purposeful conservation of resources, both as a path to the less exploitative relation to nature and as preparation for potentially disastrous environmental changes in the future. But in order to clear a space for this anti-productivist vision, the quasi-Hegelian project of the construction of a second nature, an entirely human-centered world, must be abandoned. And to do this requires, in the first instance, recognition of the persistence of a natural world that is and will continue to be, as Adorno says in the second passage, at least to some extent unmediated by human interventions. Of course, we are not simply to wait for the blowback from a nature degraded by climate change, extinctions, and soil degradation, among other things. A political movement will be required that can draw limits to and eventually push back against industrial extractivism that regards nature as fit only for human exploitation. As I was rereading this, I was realizing there's an implicit critique of the Anthropocene concept in what I just said. And I'd be happy to talk about that later on if anyone's interested. So, before we get started, I want to just stipulatively define some of the terms I'm using here. And the observations, of course, I've made so far are just preliminary. I'm going to make an argument. But let's talk about some of these terms and how I'm using them. So socialism is often understood as advocacy of the socialization of the means of production necessary for an industrial economy. How is eco-socialism different from that? This is my use of the term. An initial assumption is that there exists a natural economy consisting of goods and services drawn directly from the natural world that enable any form of human needs satisfaction to be possible. Eco-socialism advocates the socialization of such natural goods and services necessary for human subsistence, of course, in addition to the socialization of labor. The notion of self-subsistence, I realize, is ambiguous. I myself think that the continuance and even growth of an agrarian economy is a necessary and desirable feature of such self-subsistence, but I don't argue this view here. I'm happy to argue it later, but I don't argue it right now. But I'm, as with at least one of the talks this afternoon, broadly speaking, I'm pro-agrarian, so as you'll see. What I will argue for is how the possession of land and territory, through land ownership and/or territorial rights must be a central feature of the socialization of natural goods. But first, we need to distinguish land from territory as such. And this is the way I'm going to do it here. I regard land as what philosophers call a natural kind. That is, an entity found prior to human intervention into the natural world. To the extent that land, and when I say land, I always think of water as well. So let's just make that as an assumption. Land and water is utilized for various human purposes. It is transformed into so-called natural resources. I don't think anyone should ever hear the term natural resources and not get angry. Because, of course, most natural resources are used for all kinds of things that we don't really need, but not always. In this transformation, land is transmuted into an intentional kind, that is, into territory. Territories are lands modified in accordance with various human intentions, whether as zones of extraction for industrial raw materials, areas for agricultural cultivation for subsistence needs, or perhaps for profit, and even nature preserves or natural preserves that are not used productively at all. So the intentions can vary, but they're always human intentions. Finally, I use the terms ownership and rights in a non-stringent way to refer to possession or claims to land or territory. Ownership encompasses direct possession of natural goods and services, land, of course, and may be claimed by individuals, institutions, or associations as, you guessed it, private, public, or common property. Rights designate high-priority norms, mandating legitimate claims to use or possession of something, in this case, territory. I use neither term with any particular legal or moral connotations. Rather, I see them as political norms, inasmuch as they are contestable, but also justifiable under various conceptions of social justice. I'm actually struggling with whether I should use the word rights at all. As we'll see later on, in some ways, the term territorial rights is synonymous with territoriality, but I'll say a little bit more about that later on. Nevertheless, I live in a world where people talk about rights constantly, so I've adapted to that philosophical jargon for the moment. But my point here is just I don't mean anything highfalutin by the idea of rights. I don't know how you translate highfalutin into German. Sorry. I'm trying not to do that again. I employ these various concepts and terms to make the following three-part argument. So first, land has both inherent social value for the reproduction of human life in a way not always acknowledged in 20th century social theory, and increasing economic value in the 21st century. It's therefore a vital, important arena for socialization if the problems generated by its intensifying exploitation are to be avoided. Second, socialization will involve the protection of existing common property regimes and the revitalization of lapsed, destroyed, or endangered common property. And it is only through this that it will be possible to sustain the natural economy upon which so much human and non-human life depends. Third, a conception of territorial rights will be necessary to defend common property regimes in the face of political and economic pressures to eliminate them. And these rights can best be justified as essential for sustaining ecosystems and natural economies. So, the rest of the talk, I'm basically going to talk about each of these points. What's land? How has the use of it changed? Why is it important now? Secondly, the connection I see between common property or the commons and natural economies. Finally, territorial rights and the justification of them. So let's start with the first issue. There's a large recent literature, I'm sorry, I should stop for a second. So two quotations, one by Vickert Burgess and Carl Folk. They're not the only ones to use the term of socio-ecological systems, but I think they were among the ones that first developed in the 90s. And then secondly, the first of two quotations from this wonderful research and piece by Alf Hornborg, a Swedish geographer, having to do with changes in land usage over the last couple of hundred years. Good? There's a large recent literature recalling the fundamental importance of land for human social reproduction. We've actually heard a lot about that at this conference. This goes together with the reevaluation of such concepts as place or home, all highlighting the significance of physical locality in human cultures, institutions, and material sustenance. Conceptually, the recent development of the concept of socio-ecological systems summarizes this general perspective. Human societies, even the most openly exploitative ones, exist in a relation to natural systems that sustain them. And however, the particular ways in which this is done vary significantly. As others have written, no particular relation to natural goods is inherent in human behavior, as it seems to be in most other species. Particularly the case, humans can engage in dysfunctional relations to natural systems, as I'm sure you know. This gives humans wide latitude to vary the ways in which nature is used for human purposes. And of course, this also depends on technological innovations that make possible new uses of natural goods. With the invention of means to use fossil fuels for industrialization in the late 18th and 19th centuries, a massive devaluation of land as a factor of production occurred. As Hornberg notes, first quote, or second quote up on the screen, this innovation enabled energy needs to be dissociated from land use. Subsurficial, it's a geographical term, right, under the surface of the earth, subsurficial processes producing coal and oil now became the chief means of producing energy, not animal and plant products and byproducts of forestry and agriculture. Land seemed unneeded for anything but food production, and even that was aided by fossil fuel-based fertilizers and animal feed. The development of planet-wide supply chains for energy production were followed by similarly spread out circuits of other essential goods, sometimes obviously including food, all enabled by the universalization of fossil fuels as a source for industrial materials and for powering industrial enterprises. Yet, in a kind of historical irony, land has made a comeback in the 21st century, becoming again a tremendous source of value. And I've learned a lot from some of your talks about how to think about that value, what it is, and so on. A source of value that is fundamentally non-fungible. Non-fungible, if I understand it correctly, means non-substitutable. You can't replace it with anything else necessarily. Non-fungible in a way that is distinct from how energy resources were regarded until recently. As Hornberg indicates, I think we're moving on now to the second quotation, as Hornberg indicates, the crisis in the declining availability, and even more important, in a capitalist economy, the profitability of fossil fuels has opened the way for increasing interest and therefore investment, of course, in land that can enable non-fossil fuel-based energy production of various kinds. And now I'll let you read his quotation here. And so this is probably the point he's making. Add to this, in addition, the increasing production of biofuels derived from agricultural products and the sources of energy, just as much as food, are becoming relocalized and rematerialized, especially in comparison to those prevalent in the 19th and 20th centuries. And this is to say that as food and fuel again become rival outputs of agricultural production and land use in general, competition for ownership of land resources increases significantly. And this is all happening, some would contend, in tandem with a crisis of profitability in industrial enterprises. Now, the reasons for this are controversial, and this is not the place to consider various theories, and I'm probably not the person to discuss them. There are others here that know a lot about this. But faced with some sort of crisis in profitability, financial capital is revaluing land and water resources as increasingly attractive investment opportunities. And this, of course, makes land ownership again a primary site of contention and conflict. Here is a reason why. A socialist understanding of the transformation of labor power into social property in the 21st century should also encompass, I would claim, an eco-socialist conception of the socialization of land. The choice between different types of socio-ecological systems must involve a choice as to the primary purposes of land use, among other things. And here the choice is, and this is the relevance of the Willow quotation, the second quotation. The choice is between a subsistence-based approach to land use, focusing on food production, and an extractivist approach, maximizing the profitability of land in service to industrial economies. In a world of overpopulation and looming scarcities of natural goods, continuing the search for materials to fuel industrial expansion is unsustainable. This is true, by the way, even if the extraction is green or eco-modernist. In some sense, it must be since superficial sources from the surface of the earth, of energy production involving land are meant as alternatives to fossil fuel use. Extractivism underlies any sociological system that can be characterized as omnivorous. And this is a term I probably should have put a quotation up about, but the notion of omnivorous is just the idea that you have a global world of consumers and corporations serving these consumers, and they seek access to what they want wherever it is, without regard to any particular locale, certainly not necessarily their own locale. And after they've pillaged one region, of course, they move on to another. Multiple examples. I was just talking to someone about the tragedy of the North Atlantic fisheries, a major example of this sort of thing, as you know. Some of you know. One way, then, to understand the current struggles over land and they're occurring with increasing intensity, of course, is a contest between subsistence-based and profit-based systems. The former requires socialization of land, the latter requires privatization of land. But what do such systems actually entail in terms of principles and institutions of ownership and rights? So here's now an alert. Philosophy's coming shortly. So this is the second part of the talk, relation between common property and ownership. So these are two quotations from Elinor Ostrom, who's been mentioned previously in this conference. Take a minute to look at them. The second one is a doozy. I don't know how to translate doozy into German either. One of the most important rediscoveries in social theory over the last generation has been that of the commons, common property, and common property institutions. Of course, such ideas and institutions never went away in a literal sense, but they've been under siege for centuries through the enclosure movements that accompanied and facilitated the development of global markets in capital goods and commodities. They've also suffered from the increasing strength of modern states to regulate, usually to the benefit of capitalist firms, markets, and other forms of economic production and exchange. It's clearly imperative in discussing commons regimes to distinguish them from a prevalent misunderstanding made in an earlier generation about the commons. This is the equation of them with the absence of ownership rights of any kind, and the assumption that such rights must flow either from individuals or from states, that is, as private or public property. I'm arguing this is just clearly wrong. The concept of the commons, of course, challenges this oversimplification, and as some theorists have emphasized, there are actually four, not two, possible ownership regimes, consisting of private property, public property, common property, and no property, open zones, as they're sometimes called. The earlier theorists, Garrett Hardin is often mentioned here, simply conflate the last two, that common property and open or unowned zones are the same thing. Clearly they're not. And Ostrom, to her credit, has done maybe more than anyone to highlight that difference. As you know, she has, among others, fruitfully re-theorized the commons within the paradigm of rational choice theory, which takes the standpoint of individual actors, producers or consumers, and evaluates the relative merits of different institutional contexts for interaction among these individuals. So there's no misunderstanding. I'm not a rational choice theorist, but I do like some of Ostrom's work, so let's just go with the language because I think she has a very important point to make. As is summarized in the first quotation, she's made an argument that common property regimes are often more successful at managing resources sustainably for long periods of time than either markets or states. The reasons for this are given in the second quotation. First, the commons provides a mechanism for self-correction of use levels that is more sensitive to unanticipated changes in resource availability than either quasi-anarchic market mechanisms or expert-oriented state agencies. Again, fisheries seems to be the most obvious examples of this, but there are others as well. Second advantage of common property, commons also provide effective enforcement tools through the direct interaction of users rather than the more indirect methods of states or markets. Now, what this means more generally is that it's only when commons principles of ownership and common property institutions are in play is it likely that use of natural goods will not outrun what is sustainable. A robust system of common property and land is therefore one concretization or meaning of what socialization means in agrarian settings. It should be obvious here that while commons may at times have productive connections to markets, it is the subsistence functions for users of commons institutions that is paramount. Subsistence first, markets for goods second, not the other way around. We might reference the contemporary conception of food sovereignty as one example of this, been very influenced by food sovereignty advocates in a way I don't really talk about here. Ownership for use by the producers of food themselves is the first, though not necessarily the last, priority for those claiming sovereignty over agriculturally productive lands. But there are other possible cases. So For instance, these two lists, the first list is directly relevant. These are examples of common property institutions. I've actually been speaking about the third example so far, resource users collectives, farmers collectives, and so on. The second note, I will talk more about that in a minute. And the third quote, I'll comment on presently. The first list on the left gives cases of common property institutions. The second, which we will consider in a moment, is territorial institutions that may be compatible with common property regimes. So it's not an either or, it's a plus, right? It's this may be instantiated or protected or embodied in the second. At least that's one possibility. The first list shows that, far from being exclusively applicable to peasants, farmers, and the like, commons can play a role in the socialized management of a great variety of natural goods, including, above all, land, both rural and urban. So, I mean, the urban case is interesting because, of course, it's often a built environment on top of land, but I think it's applicable in various ways. I'm not going to talk about that right now. Debates over property and ownership in the 20th century largely revolved around differences between private and public property, market and state ownership, or capitalization or socialization of land and other natural goods. But in the 21st century, it's imperative to consider the third alternative, that of the commons, as a mechanism for socialization. And this is because both private and public ownership systems have shown themselves complicit in a massive looting of intact natural goods without consideration of long-term sustainability, or for that matter, of the short-term survival of the peoples already subsisting from these goods. I won't say much about the second quotation. It was meant as a suggestion of how to expand this idea of the commons to what Sophie Gosselin, who's a French activist, calls the terrestrial commons. There's some problems with doing that. I'm a partial skeptic about this idea because I'm a localist and an agrarian, but I think it's suggestive and particularly perhaps applicable to urban populations who don't have any direct or have lost any direct connection to local commons. So I just flag it as a possible extension of the idea, but I'm not going to discuss it further. Aside from questions about the efficacy of common property regimes in different contexts, we need to ask this question: how can commons institutions protect and maintain natural goods and services in the face of hostile states and expanding markets? And to answer it is the reason why we must now shift our focus from common property and land to that of territorial rights and governance. So here we go. Part 3, last part. I have a conclusion, but if we run out of time, skip the conclusion. To recall maybe I'll just let you read these for a second. And so the first, very briefly, the first quotation is what I referred to. In some sense, the geographical notion of territoriality is, in a way, close to the philosophical idea of territorial rights, right? If you can establish territoriality as a people or a group or a commons of some sort, then you've got the rights. I mean, it just follows, on my view. But nevertheless, I say I've been living in philosophy world for a while, so rights talk is something that just you can do in your sleep. The second point, of course, is we're just out of space. We're not out of space as an absolute thing, of course, but we're out of space in terms of maintaining what I would generalize what Sachs is saying in terms of maintaining industrial society. Industrial society is not going anywhere, but it's starting to shrink. And the question is, what are the rest of the people in the world going to do as the resources run out to maintain a kind of high consumption industrial society? But I don't answer that question directly here, just flagging it. So part 3, land and territorial rights. To recall our definition of territory, it's land regarded from the point of view of a specific purpose or goal. If such a purpose or goal is tied to some essential characteristics of land, then a right to territory can be justified on this basis. Such a right could legitimate a governing institution, such as the ones listed on the previous slide, a governing institution that claims exclusive control over a given territory. I will briefly consider and reject two common justifications for such territorial rights, and then offer my own conception of such a right, which I refer to as an ecosystem-based right to territory. So I'll just sort of end this section with a definition of that. But I'm, as philosophers love to do, I'm going to criticize and demolish two other arguments, hopefully demolish two other arguments for territorial rights that really have been very common and very influential. So here goes. Actually, hold on. Yeah, I skipped a slide, didn't I? Sorry. Let's back up a little bit then. I'll come back to the other later. When territory is considered as something to which persons or peoples are entitled, it has usually been linked with either property rights or national identity. So these are the two theories I'm going to discuss. Karen Nines, contemporary of mine, has written some interesting stuff on territory. As she says herself in the title, a Lockean or Neo-Lockean theory. I'll discuss that in a minute. Tamar Meisels is a advocate of national rights, and national rights to territory is another prevalent idea in the literature. My contention here is that neither of these theories justifies a territorial right. So let's take the first, call it the proprietary theory, or a Neo-Lockean justification for private property, if you like. If an agent who may be an individual, but in the case of territories is more commonly a state, changes the territory in some way, and this change is beneficial, or as she puts it, morally valuable, then they may claim a right to the territory. Now, what counts as beneficial? The Lockean idea, as mentioned in a previous talk, tends to be one of use and improvement, with their connotations of the efficient production of more economic goods and services. Yet this idea is easily seen to be a largely arbitrary claim on territory in two respects. First, why are the uses to which a given land will be put ones that are necessary in that particular place or territory? Nothing makes any given territory essential for economic use and improvement, since most so-called natural resources can be found and extracted from multiple locations. Now, a proprietary theorist might respond that, in the absence of any other expressed intentions, there's no reason that a territory should not be claimed by someone that seeks to extract its resources. But that's exactly the problem. In a crowded world and in the face of competing claims, why should this claim be recognized here? Second, what justification can be given for the idea of use and improvement that does not include either consideration of other uses such as subsistence for the people who may be there, or provision for maintaining a territory's goods and services over time? Benefit, especially in a depleted world, our world, should not favor improvement over maintenance, nor further diminish already limited and disappearing natural goods. That was quick. I realize we can talk more about that justification later if there's interest in it. I don't know how many Locke fans there are in the audience. He's certainly been dumped on by more than one speaker in the last 2 days. So I'm just piling on here, and we'll see if anybody wants to push back. Second theory fares no better, in my view. It relies on a questionable connection between national identities and territoriality. And by the way, just parenthetically, maybe it'll become clear, I have a particular theory of indigeneity, which is sometimes associated with this idea. I think it's completely different from the idea of national identity. This has to do with nation states. That has to do with something entirely different, among other things, land and belonging to a land. So just to clear that point, at least nominally. So I'm talking about national identity specifically. Of course, there can be important connections between peoples and territories, for instance, between indigenous peoples. In fact, I will argue that there is a conceptual connection between them, if properly understood, between peoples and territories. And here's a crucial point. Nations are not the same as peoples. They have a more specific connotation that are a connotation of groups that are, or in some accounts, believe themselves to be related by common ethnicities. Such ethnicities are malleable, changeable, but more important, they are movable. As we know, national groups have often changed their geographical locations while retaining communal ties and relationships. But territories stay put. Peoples may be constituted as those who live in them, but these are not, or almost never, nations in the proper meaning of the term. So being a nation implies nothing about a right to be in, own, or claim a specific territory. Only if all other peoples living in such a territory are removed, eliminated, or subordinated, sound familiar? Can a national group that then have succeeded in occupying it. But that is a matter of force, not right. So the second theory does not go through. All right, that's a lot of negativity. So what then can justify a right to territory? First, we must understand both what geographers think about what territoriality is in general, and this is now the one I skipped to. I skipped a slide. What territoriality is in general and what global distribution of territoriality has resulted from the contemporary environmental crisis. So as James McCarthy, important geographer, writes, territoriality has, as its most fundamental feature, the exercise of power over a bounded space. And this power may be one of states, but may also be held by peoples and other institutional forms for the control of territory. And I refer you back to the list before, and we can go back later if you want. Its exercise, the exercise of power, when legitimate, would constitute a right to have this power over a particular place. And yet, as Wolfgang Sachs reminds us, human beings, at least in their current configuration, are locked in a struggle for land to meet their needs or desires that has become scarce. The land has, their needs and desires haven't become scarce. The land has become scarce. It's this scarcity, driven by overconsumption and overpopulation in the present era, that is driving the struggle for land and giving renewed importance to establishing legitimate rights to territory. And so two aspects of a legitimate territorial right need mentioning here. First, for a right to obtain, there must be a legitimate claimant of the right. Legitimacy is determined here by whether there is a population, a people, that has a particular relation to the land such that the existence of the people and the existence of the territory as a necessary description of the purposes ascribed to the land are mutually implicating or determining. I call this the conceptual connection. If the people must be defined by their location in land, to the land, or the land must be defined by its relation to the people, then you have a fit. You have a territorial right, or as in geographical terms, you have the condition of territoriality. This conceptual connection has two obvious examples. I've already mentioned them. First, food producers, farmers and fishers who require the land and water for their subsistence. And secondly, just mentioned, indigenous peoples who ascribe a certain meaning to lands that are at the same time give their own peoples a certain identity. These are clearly not the only examples. One term sometimes used to cover multiple examples, I wasn't going to use it here, but I might as well, is the term ecosystem peoples. That is, peoples whose very identity and sustenance or existence is tied to a particular ecosystem. So peoples with long established common property institutions that have inherited and maintained, that they have inherited and maintained would be another way to characterize this connection and would apply to a wide range of cases. But the two examples I think should serve for the moment. Now, the second aspect of a territorial right is what gives it legitimacy. Is the one referred to by the quotation from Avery Kohler. So take a minute and look at this quotation. I think it's a fairly clear point. There's a contrast here with property rights, which I won't belabor. The important idea is the idea of the stewardship element. So the second idea of a territorial right is this: what he calls the stewardship element of a territorial right is also essential inasmuch as the territory retains value only to the extent that it is able to play a role in providing sustenance to an ecosystem and a people over time. Now, Kohler here emphasizes a dimension that it will be familiar to environmental philosophers, that is, responsibilities or duties to future generations. But it's equally important to note that unlike other attempts at legitimating territorial rights, which I've just discussed, this justification focuses on what is specific about particular territories, their role in supporting particular populations, by the way, both human and non-human. But humans are the ones that talk about rights all the time, so we'll stick with them. A direct link is established between territories and peoples through the necessity of the territory to the sustenance of a people. And this is the rationale for an ecosystem-based right to territory. And here's a statement of the right. I will read this. Why not? Peoples inhabiting territories comprising distinct ecosystems have the right to jurisdictional authority over these territories sufficient to maintain the goods and services of those ecosystems. And just to flag it, there must be a, as they call it, conceptual connection between the people and territory that gives them the right to jurisdictional authority, which means authority over that, things happening within that territory. And there's what I call elsewhere a sustainability proviso, that is that they have this authority only to the extent and for so long as they maintain the goods and services of that ecosystem. Notice if they plunder themselves, if they pull the rug out from under their own feet, use up the resources of the territory, or engage in practices that will do that, they lose the right. So there's nothing permanent about this. It's completely dependent on, as I said, intentions and purposes of employing the right. So I can stop now, or talk a little bit about. Okay, I'll see where I get in 3 more minutes. I'm almost finished. So now to a conclusion, based on these 2 quotations, so we can look at them quickly. The first may be a little mysterious, I don't know, unless people happen to have read Dieter Grimm's excellent book on sovereignty. I'll explain it. The second is a definition from Brian Norden of a natural constitution. I'll also talk about that. So, how could such a territorial right be implemented, and what problems would be faced in doing so, or must be faced? I argue in my recent book that only a claim of sovereignty by peoples connected to ecosystems is sufficient for the realization of the goals established by their territorial rights. And this is the case for 2 reasons. First, peoples require a political agency in order to assert rights, make claims, and implement policies. Not necessarily a state, but a political agency of some sort. Second, if such a political agency is established, whether it's a small but independent state, a local or indigenous government, a provincial administration, perhaps, the question immediately arises as to what relation it will have to other political agencies. And that's what Grimm means by an external dimension. As he says, this question of external relations arises in terms of who can legitimately claim sovereignty, and that now becomes an issue. And once different agencies have rights over territory, and these are established, they will need to ensure their territoriality and therefore claim sovereignty, which means, on my understanding, ultimate authority over what most concerns them. In this book, here's another German word, I really nerd out, as they say in the United States, on sovereignty rights. I have a lot to say about sovereignty. I'm not going to impose any of that on you, just to flag it. But I will flag it at this point. And one point I want to make about it is that Dieter Grimm and other state-oriented jurists, people that think sovereignty always inheres in states, who have written about sovereignty, may not see that this, what he calls external relation, can arise within a state. And if there are other political agencies, such as a territory or people that living within the state, that may claim rights over territory that the state may view as its own. So one thing I do in this book is to disassociate sovereignty claims from state sovereignty claims. It's a long argument. I'm not going to bore you right now. But the point is that this external relation, which makes sovereignty claims absolutely essential, can exist within states as well as outside them. At least that's what I would claim. There are different ways in which such conflicts might be resolved so that peoples can maintain their territorial rights while states exercise their prerogatives in other domains. One way is to view sovereignty as functional rather than absolute, but I'm not going to say more about that at this point. Just a mention of the last quotation, and then I'll stop. How to institutionalize territorial rights, such as has been advocated here, without continually risking them in such struggles and contests. And the sovereignty concept is meant to give some additional weapons. If you can think of a philosophical concept as a weapon for a minute, I think it is in certain contexts. It's a justification, it's legitimacy, and that delegitimates what you're opposing. But it's to give additional weapons to various peoples struggling for territory in various situations. But of course, you don't want to fight all the time, right? So the question is, what lies beyond these struggles? And this, I think, could be the idea of a natural constitution that recognizes, such a constitution recognizes the rights of peoples to inhabit and maintain particular places, as Brian Norton suggests. The idea of recognition is key here. It's a struggle for recognition, and I'm totally aware of the history of this concept, but I won't go into it. It's a struggle for recognition of a territorial right that in any case is at issue. So instantiating that recognition in a constitution is one way to at least provisionally resolve this struggle. And this is perhaps where my own remarks today come into contact with the discussion in Germany. And at this conference on socialization, Germany is lucky in one respect to already have some aspects of this idea of a territorial right in the Basic Law, Article 15, which has been mentioned under this rubric of socialization. Some other countries go further. They have rights to nature, as it's called, or indigenous rights guarantees. These are also versions of this idea of a natural constitution. All of this, I hope, will make the struggle for socialized land ownership and beyond that, territorial rights more possible. And so I end with, I'm sorry I don't do this a lot, a little self-advertisement. If you want to hear more about sovereignty and my theory of it, you can consult this book. And otherwise, I simply say thank you.